right, brother, right. Let's go ahead and get the screen moving. All right. I want to say good evening to those of you that are joining us in person and those that are live for our Heritage Lecture Series as we begin tonight to unpack one of what I think is one of the most important works that's been put together for the life and the legacy and the work of Dr. Amos N. Wilson, who is the author of a book that I think is critical for all of us to have, is the Blueprint for Black Power. Dr. Amos Wilson is well known within the liberation circles. He's well known within the Pan-African world, and he is one of the scholars that we read a lot of in order to understand how to navigate a system in which we are finding ourselves trapped back in. And so for this 8th year of the Heritage Lecture Series, I want us to look at this work tonight, at least looking at the first essay from the work. You can go to the next screen, brother, right? The Falsification of African Consciousness, Eurocentric History, Psychiatry, and the Politics of White Supremacy. In this work, Dr. Wilson really lays out and he really begins to expose the role that Eurocentric history writing plays in rationalizing European oppression of African people and the falsification of African consciousness, meaning that our identity isn't derived from our African history. Instead, it is derived from our action, reaction, and interaction with European oppression, as they have had a lasting role on our mental and behavioral maladaptiveness of oppressed African people, and that it is part of a political, economic necessity for us to stay where we are for the maintenance of white domination and imperialism. This is going to be a very, very heavy component tonight for what we are going to look at, especially with the rise of what I talked about on Sunday as a dying colonialism. I believe, this is just me, I believe that colonialism is on its last breath. There are vestiges of colonialism that still exist. And colonialism, when colonialism dies, so does white supremacy. Because white supremacy is based upon every model of colonialism that has ever existed. Everything from the way we think, the way we carry ourselves, the concern we have about how our hair is, how wide our nose is, how we walk, how we talk, whether we speak so-called proper English, which I'll deal with tonight, and the colonization of our language, all the way to the banking system that we use. The current banking system we have is rooted in a colonial period in history. So this work on tonight, looking at the falsification of African consciousness, is an attempt for this week for us to really begin to re-examine not our blackness, but how do we come out of somebody else's model that's benefiting them but destroying us at the same time. So this is extra deep water. For those that was here last year with the work by Ngugi Thiong'o and the decolonization of the language, If you thought that was deep, it's going to get deeper this week as we look at it. And so in this work, in this book that was put together by AWS, it's a series of books. They took 3 of his essays that he has done in order to kind of shape our understanding and our identity as children of Africa living in a colonized, whitewashed world. The first lecture that we're going to look at on tonight, we're going to look at the 3 different lectures, but we're going to look at them each night. The first lecture, and Brother Wright, you can just kind of go to the other slides as well. So I'm on the one that says lecture information for those that are at the house, those that are out watching in other parts of the country and other parts of the world. The first lecture that we're going to look at tonight, lecture 1, he gave on February 5th, 1989 at the Afrikan Echoes in Newark, New Jersey. What he did in Newark, New Jersey at this community center, this community gathering place, was to actually talk about what we're going to deal with on tonight and look at this idea of a European historiography of an oppression. And he's going to expose it and talk about an African analysis and perspective. So that's where we are tonight. Lecture 2, he takes and looks at this sterling critique of the criminal justice system and the mental health establishment, and that it was, and he delivered this at the auditorium of Harlem Hospital. So he was in Newark for the first one, 1989. He's at the Harlem Hospital on Martin Luther King's birthday in 1985. And this other one he did not present, he simply wrote. The third one, which he actually started writing, handwriting, and he trashed it. He balled it up, threw it in the trash, and then he went back and recreated it. He recrafted it to meet what he believed was his expectation of what he was doing. And he delves into the areas of sociopathology, psychopathology, labeling as social control, because that's what they do, they label us. Y'all hear it now, DEI, they label us for social control, domination, and the mislabeling of behavior, taking our kids and saying they got ADHD and all these other things. The medicalization of African social problems, giving them Ritalin, giving them all kind of drugs because they can't teach the African mind, so they got to numb it and dumb it down, because many of our children are far advanced than where their children are. So they got to medically induce them and then put them in special education. And the common symptoms of pathology, normalcy in oppressed African people, that when we are oppressed, we act a certain way. That's why we carry ourselves a certain way. You see these young women on TikTok, you see them on social media showing every piece of skin they got that they can get away with. You see them acting like gold diggers. You see these guys acting as if they're pimps. You see them acting as if they are drug dealers. Young people showing guns and a lot of money. These are symptoms of oppression. And we've got to begin to think through this on how we're going to help our people. And so in the introduction, I want to deal with this idea that the falsification in 2025 still continues, that we are still lost. We don't really know who we are. We got an idea, but we push against it. I was talking to a pastor earlier who has my new book, and he said that he thought he was going crazy because of the thoughts he was having until he read the book. And he said, man, exactly what you said in the book is what I've been thinking, but I thought I was thinking wrong. Why? because his thinking goes against freedom for himself, and he's trying to find a way to fit into a Eurocentric world that has not been designed or created for him and for us. And we find ourselves doing the same thing, that we code switch. Y'all know what code switching is, right? Yeah, we act one way when we around us. And then when we around them, we act totally different. Because we try not to make them feel uncomfortable while forcing ourselves to feel absolutely uncomfortable. And so I want to start off with a quote that I received this morning from a Salon online magazine. Salon is a magazine. And the title of the article that they wrote, that Amanda Marcotte wrote, and it was released today, slavery produced a genuine affection between the races. Hegseth, who's now head of the DOD, Hegseth Church foretold DEI firings. So there's churches that are still promoting and pushing this agenda. Listen to this. Per Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's pastor, quote, slavery produced in the South a genuine affection between the races that we believe we can say has never existed in our nation before the war or since. Talking about Civil War. Wilson wrote in his 1996 defense of Confederate slave owners, quote, Southern slavery as it was. That was the name of what he wrote, Confederate slavery as it was. Quote, there has never been a multiracial society which has existed with such mutual intimacy and harmony in the history of the world. Slaves got along with masters. It was all love. They worked together hand in hand. He painted slavery as a Edenic paradise, meaning it was like the Garden of Eden. It was perfect for those that were captured in it. So our ancestors were happy to be enslaved. Got to put this in context of what's taking place today with all the firings and them getting rid of the 1890 scholarship at the HBCUs. A&M lost theirs, Tuskegee lost theirs, North Carolina A&T lost theirs. Who else? Florida A&M lost theirs. All the land grant institutions lost this very valuable scholarship because you don't need it if you're going to get back into slavery. Quote, slave life was to the slave a life of plenty, of simple pleasures, of food, clothes, and good medical care, end quote. The Defense Secretary of the United States, this is the kind of preaching he's been sitting under. What do you think you get when you sit under preaching for a period of time? You start, if you're not careful, and they're not right, you start thinking like them. Pete Hegseth, the man that's leading the military, the man that's in charge of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the man that fired the most qualified black candidate to ever lead the Joint Chiefs of Staff and replaced him with somebody they got to give a waiver to because he doesn't qualify outside of being a white male. That is DEI at its very basic core. He doesn't qualify, but you put him there. You fire the head of the Navy, a woman, because she's a woman. The importance of consciousness and history. As a historian, I'm going to love this section on tonight. I'm going to love this tonight because I understand exactly what Dr. Wilson is saying. Listen to this. The psychology, consciousness, and behavioral tendencies of individuals and society are to a very significant extent the product of their personal and collective histories. When you know your history, you act a certain way. When you know who you are, you act a certain way. When you were growing up in your household and you acted out of character, your family tend to remind you, now Jesse, you're Olive. We don't act like that. If I'm wrong, tell me. Philip, you're a Western. Westerns don't do that. Right? I heard that. You are Anderson. You are expected to be smart. You are expected to excel. You are expected. Anything less is unacceptable. That's a consciousness. That's a psychological work that's going on. But what happens when it's distorted? What happens when you don't know your history? When you don't know your personal history and your collective history? Both personal and collective psychology are constructed from those experiences which can be consciously retrieved from memory, as well as those experiences which have been forgotten or repressed, but which still represent themselves in individual and collective habits, tendencies, traditions, emotional responsivities, perspectives, ways of processing information, attitudes, reflex-like reactions to certain stimuli and situations. When certain things happen, they take you back to your childhood. It causes certain memories that you had long forgotten about to remember. Certain smells remind you of certain people. Certain situations remind you of certain occasions that took place. You find nostalgia when individuals put up a Christmas tree and they remember when they were a kid. All this is important because what happens is that what we have gone through is in not just our psychology, not just in our mind, it's in our DNA. There's a study that was done on rats because they wanted to see what would happen if a rat was able to be fed when certain bell rung. And they knew the bell meant go eat. So they trained these rats to go eat. Here's what happened. The rats became obese. But they kept eating every time the bell rung. Every time it rung, they ate. Well, the rats had other rats. The newer rats that had not been trained came out obese. And they learned that when the bell rung, to go eat. They had rats. Guess how those rats came out? Obese. It became something that was lodged into the DNA, into the rats, that they would carry on what had been passed down from several generations of rats. What does that have to do with us? Everything. We don't want to admit it, but all of us sitting in here, black folks that are watching right now, are still suffering from the psychosis of being enslaved. We didn't have chains on our wrists. We didn't have chains on our ankles. We didn't grow up in a plantation. We didn't have to go pick cotton and rice and tobacco. But there was something lodged in our ancestors that broke them and that went from generation to generation. Don't go out there and embarrass me. It's no different than saying, oh, forgive him, Mr. John. And you ain't looking at Mr. John, you looking down at Mr. John's shoe. Forgive him, Mr. John. That boy ain't got no sense. There's no difference. What we find is that there is long-term ramifications for what our ancestors had to go through that's been passed down. One of the things that we don't know is this idea of being a boy and you a grown man. Still being treated like a little boy. And if we're not careful, we'll fall right back into that position in order to keep the peace. Instead of saying, no, I'm a man. No. Out in that society, if the blue lights get behind you, you become a boy real quick. Whereas a white man would get the blue lights behind him, he'll cuss the cop out. There's these long-term ramifications. The cops being the next generation of patty rollers or those that patrol the plantation. Where your papers at is what they said then, right? What they say now? License and registration. They still want the papers. It is a carryover. All this stuff, and we don't put the two together because we say, you know, that was then, this is now. No. In the minds of some people, then was better. We got to go back to when it was better. We got to make America, got to go back. And so consciousness is under threat. And it's under threat by way of manipulation. Mass media manipulates us. Black folk mad. Joy Reid no longer has her MSNBC show. But Rachel Maddow got hers. And that boring woman, whatever her name is, that come on at 4 o'clock, she got hers. But they fired Melissa Perry. They fired Tiffany Cross. Now they just fired Joy Reid. Why? Manipulation. And I want to see what they had at Joy Reid's time, and who did they put? Michael Steele. Black man, Republican. Manipulation. Television shows. We all love Good Times, right? That was one of our favorite shows. Manipulation. Unless you've been in Cabrini Green, you realize that's a lie. The Jeffersons, stereotype. He moved on up to the east side, him and his wife, and he's still ghetto. Still loud, still shuck and jive, but he's successful. Television shows. You had Living Single, one of my favorite shows. They stole the idea of living single and made friends. Television shows. Hollywood. Then he got to go into that with all these slave movies. 12 Years a Slave. Just see it time and time again. And then social media. It's this manipulation that takes place, and history is being tainted. And we're being manipulated. Quote from Dr. Wilson, to manipulate history. Because they're trying their best to rewrite history. And they're doing their best to rewrite history because if you ever discover who you are, you're free. To manipulate history is to manipulate consciousness. To manipulate consciousness is to manipulate possibilities, and to manipulate possibilities is to manipulate power. If I can get you to deny your history, I can take your power. I can win. And all I got to do is suppress your history or tell you, watch this, you come from slaves. No, I don't. I don't. Did you know that there were castles in Ethiopia? Most folk don't know that. There are castles in the great kingdom of Mali, great empires. Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, but he wasn't greater than Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa was giving away gold to Europeans. That's how they got interested in going to Africa. He was just giving it away. But if we don't know our history, they can manipulate it and lie. See, it's different from being enslaved and being a slave. Our ancestors were enslaved. They were not slaves. That's two different realities. Slave is your being. It is your ontological reality. That's who you are. If I'm enslaved, I'm being forced to be something God did not create me to be. And the history of the oppressed, as written by the oppressors, shaped the consciousness and psychology of both oppressed and oppressor. That's what King was saying. King was saying that white people are as worse in a shape as we are, because they honestly believe this foolishness that they keep peddling. It helps to legitimate the oppressive system and to maintain an imbalance of power in favor of the oppressor. When you don't know your history, I have no problem with other topics and themes in school. I have no problem with other subjects. But I was drawn to history because of my grandmother, who told me that if they want to hide something from you, they'll put it in a book. And we don't read as a people, collectively. Fight against it. We'll rather talk, but we're talking without having the right information because we haven't read the right books. Consciousness is under threat. It was under threat when this essay was delivered in 1985 on February 5th, February 5th, 1989, was still under threat. Who was president at that time? George Bush. It's under threat. Dr. Wilson says, Eurocentric historiography is the most formidable ally of white racism and imperialism. We don't even see it in front of us because it's so blatant, and yet it's so hidden. Its treacherous role in this regard must be explored and reversed by an African-centered historiography written by African historians dedicated to historical accuracy and truth, historians who are unafraid to speak truth to power. Me giving this at CPAC, knowing I'm going to get murdered as soon as it's over. I can do it here. Can I do it in a white space that's threatening to our existence? He goes on to say, for oppression begins as a psychological fact. According to Eurocentric mental health establishments, they're the ones that determine whether we're crazy or not. We don't get to determine that. We can say that boy a little touch. But that girl a little touch. They can come in as the so-called experts and they can say it and people will listen to them. And is in good part a psychological state. If oppression is to operate with maximum efficiency, it must become and remain a psychological condition achieving self-perpetuating motion by its own internal dynamics and by its own inertial momentum. What is he saying? It's carrying on because we get these learned habits from previous generations. And instead of them teaching us, we teach our kids to be beneath somebody else without even realizing, because they don't know their history. Its reason for being is to nurture and sanction the imperialist and racist regime which fathered it. Remember those rats? They gave birth to obese rats, and they gave birth to obese rats. It's the same thing when you start talking about us when we don't know our history. Reason why. There's a reason why they didn't go after AP English. They didn't go after AP Biology. They didn't go after any other AP. They went after AP African American History. Why? Because if we let them learn their history, we can't overpower them and oppress them any longer. They're going to rise. They're going to stand up. How do you know that? Because we have historical data that backs up everything that we're saying. And they're going to know that we've been lying to them. In order to further establish the erosion of consciousness in the African, European history, or Western history, must take a prominent position of being greater by establishing a dominant position without looking as such. They can't let you know they doing it, because then you'll fight it. So they do it real slick like. European historiography, the biasing and falsification of history in ways to justify white supremacy. It involves a deliberate and serious exercise in myth making. You know, like George Washington never lied. Y'all remember hearing that? George Washington cut down the cherry tree, and they asked George, did he do it? He said, I cannot lie. I did it. Myth making. In the development of Eurocentric cultural myth, this through which rationalizes a concrete social order founded on the perpetual subordination of African people to European people. Y'all have always been slaves. Here's how they did it using the Bible. The curse of Cain. See, Adam and Eve were white. And they had white children. And what happened when Cain killed Abel and God banished him, the text says he put a mark on him. You know what that mark was? He made him black. That's the myth. But then you got the second one, the curse of Ham. And when you read the text, Noah said, curse Canaan. You say curse Ham. So if you curse Ham, who's supposed to be the father of Africans, what does that make us? We curse. They did it in religion. They did it in history. They did it all over the place. But because we couldn't read, we couldn't fight back. See, today, they can't pull that. So Hegseth's pastor, yeah, let me and him get in the room and let us have our conversation. Let us have our conversation. Because I want to know where you get your information from. Take me to your primary sources. Now, I take you to my master thesis in which I wrote about this. My master's thesis at George Mason was on whether slavery was by policy or whether it was by will of God. See, I can pull my stuff. He can't pull nothing. He's glorifying a time that none of us will agree with. But because he's a white male, surely he's right. The Eurocentric order became a social machine in science, economics, in history, in religion. It became a social machine which manufactures a consciousness and behavioral orientation in African peoples designed to serve the purpose of white supremacy. It's under threat. It's under threat. That's why the party in the White House for Black History Month, they went after Jamal Harrison Bryant because he went after Target. went after Target because Target pulled the money back from the community that it was supposed to help, because Target headquarters is in Minneapolis, where George Floyd was murdered. They were supposed to put the money in the community. They pulled it back. He called them out. So what does Mr. Man do that's in the White House? Invite all his friends, and they bring in an effigy of Jamal Harrison Bryant. And with the effigy, this is the purpose of an effigy in white history. You lynch it. And they got black folks carrying an effigy of a black pastor, quietly saying in our face, using black people, that we'll lynch him. It's in our face, but we don't know it because we haven't been introduced to the nuances of their history. And so European survival or European salvation isn't found in the community. Ours is found in the community. But in the accumulation of military power and economic wealth. We see it today with the return of this man to the White House and his alliance with Russia, and with the return to second in charge in Germany, the Conservative Party, in this last election they just had. That they are rising up around the world calling for the death of people of color. Amos Wilson reminds us survival isn't guaranteed. I need for us to understand this. It ain't guaranteed. He said there's no law in the universe that tells us our future of survival is assured. That we will continue to exist now and into the future. Do you know that there are ethnic groups in the world that no longer exist? Look at the history of Australia and see what they did to the Aboriginals. Look at what happened when they moved from Europe into South Africa, and what they did to the natives in South Africa. Now they got their land back, they fighting. This guy in the White House is saying you can come to the United States because you are an oppressed people. Never mentioning the oppression that they had to endure, but saying you are an oppressed people. Come over here because we are getting ready to recreate everything. We running around here acting as if it doesn't exist, as if we can ignore it and it'll go away. He says there are races and ethnic groups that have been virtually wiped out on the planet. They're gone. He makes this astounding statement that I think we need to take seriously. Quote, there is no guarantee that our own group will not be wiped out as well. What I'm going to argue is that we are experiencing today deja vu. 1877, the end of Reconstruction, to 1965. We are experiencing the terror that our ancestors experienced. We just don't have people walking around our neighborhood with hoods on. They ain't got to, because they got a lot of us wearing hoods. Frantz Fanon, in his book, White Skin, Black Skin, White Mask, makes that argument. That they got black skin, but their mask is not African, it's not Algerian. They act like them, they want to be like them, and they will hurt us to convince them to let them in. This is deja vu. We've been here before. But this guy in office alludes, makes this statement, and I mean, it was hot news for a minute, that laws don't apply to him if he saved the country. He said that laws can't be broken if you're saving the country. So he can do whatever he wants because he's saving the country, right? Laws are no stronger than their enforcers. That's the reason why when Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education took place, you still didn't have desegregation until almost 10, 15, 20 years later. There was a county in Virginia that literally died because they refused to desegregate. Many of our schools and teachers and school administrators will also say this. The creation of the gifted and talent program was not designed for us. It was to create segregations in our public schools. That's why it was created. It wasn't created because they say, Andrea, you are gifted. No. If she just so happened to get in there, they made the work so hard that she would quit and go back into general population. It's a preparation for prison. You can't make it here, go back into general pop, and you can be prepared to go and work in Woolworths. You can go and work at Sears, but you can't go to college because you're not smart enough. What does that do to the black psychology of our children? Sister Wallace. Gifted, frustrated. When you go back to the general population, she's going to get put out of school. We got rid of her. But watch this. Not only will she get in trouble with the teachers going back in the general population. Oh, you thought you was better than us anyway. She's alienated from the people that she just went back to. It's a preparation. But it's all by design. And so laws are no stronger than the people who enforce them. If the people who enforce the laws no longer decide to do so, the laws are of no value and have no value. It has no value. Let me get my book, because I got something I want to read to y'all. Very important. Very important. I got a few places that I need to lift up to y'all on tonight, because I want y'all to hear this out of Dr. Wilson's own words. See where we are now. I want you to see where we are now, and I want you to hear what Dr. Wilson said in 1989. We cannot put our faith in white man's laws and the laws enforced by whites. I have warned, and it bears repeating, that if there comes a day when the society has to make a choice between feeding white children and feeding black children, no amount of civil rights laws or other laws on the books will prevent those people from feeding their children first. But we already know that. They're going to look out for them, even if the law says everything is equal. So I hear this, that we are going to get rid of DEI because everything ought to be equal. I know that's code language, because I've read it in history. I've studied this. I know that you're speaking code to them. Right now, they're getting ready to pay reparations to people in the United States that don't look like us, but we couldn't get it. Listen to this and tell me if it sounds familiar in our history. Page 11. Page 11. This is what Lerone Bennett noted. Back there, 100 years ago, there was a federal law protecting voting rights in the South. There was a law that protected voting rights in the South. So what was the purpose of the 1964-65 Civil Rights and Voter Rights Act? If it was already on the books, why you got to write another one? Does this all sound vaguely familiar? And there was a National Public Accommodations Act. So the Public Accommodations Law did not begin with the freedom rides in the 1960s. We had those rights in the 1860s and 1870s. So why did Lyndon Baines Johnson have to sign something? Such, in broad outline, was the racial situation 100 years ago in the 1860s, 1870, when racism was forever abolished in America for the first time. Why? 1860, 1870, we had rights. Why we got to do it again in 1964, 1965? In order to not fall victim to the myth-making and lies, we must study history and have a memory that will not fade as the years pass and elders transition. We don't want to hear what the elders got to say. We need to sit down and talk to them. We must understand the tremendous value of the study of history for the regaining of power. If our education is not about gaining real power, we are being miseducated and misled, and we will die educated and misled. Got all these degrees and we still ain't got no power. Why should we study history? When we study history, we are able to transform history into concrete reality, into planning and development, into the construction of power, and the ability to ensure the survival of our people. Our kids don't know history. We don't know that in Montgomery, y'all been to Montgomery, y'all been to Dexter, y'all been to the Capitol. Y'all know that big fountain at that big circle? That was the farmer's market. The street coming in this way on the farmer's market, street coming in this way is commerce. That's the route the enslaved took after they got off the boat at the Alabama River, where our ancestors, and I had on the shirt today, used that white chair. There's a building when you come around the corner, a white building on the corner. That was the building that sent the telegraph to Fort Sumter starting the Civil War. And you keep coming around the corner, that's where Rosa Parks got arrested. That one little circle had enslavement, Civil War, civil rights in that one circle. But we don't know that. We just go around the bout, go up to Dexter, go up to the Capitol, and just head on out. When we study our history, we can transform history into concrete reality. If we know our history, because it ties to our social reality, everyone has something to say about our history. Don't tell us who we are. What those who look to minimize and expand a false African consciousness do is suppress the history, ban books, and create alternative narratives. Wilson notes, quote, apparently the rewriting, the distortion, and the stealing of our history must serve vital economic, political, and social functions for the Europeans, or else he would not bother and try so hard to keep our history away from us and distort it in our minds. If it ain't important, they won't worry about it. But if we ever learn our history, we begin to see things through a different lens, we get free. It's all psychological. History is psychological. History is projected in this culture as being irrelevant. What they tell you, go to STEM, right? Go to STEM. STEM is where it's at. Science, technology, engineering, mathematics. Don't worry about history. Kids grow up and go to school, they hate history. It's boring. I don't like it. History is psychological. History is projected in this culture as being irrelevant. Wilson said, I don't think that's by accident. Look at this diabolical move. When courses in college and university are apparently presented as non-political, objectively neutral, they are actually presented in the most political way. It looked like it ain't nothing. But in reality, they're shaping how you think. Sister Karen, when you were going through A&M, did you encounter a lot about Africans who shaped the education field? We had an HBCU, and they talked about these black folk that had these great intellectual minds and shape it. Did you, Sister Wallace? Why? They were on the bookshelf, they ain't tell you where it was. And they ain't tell you who to go get. Why? Because it ain't important. Just learn this theory that was created by some European as it relates to learning and teaching, right? The nature of the racist culture, is to hide its political agenda. We know what DEI means. We know what it says, but we know what they mean. We know what woke means. Woke comes out of the hip-hop culture. That don't come from them. But they took it and redefined it to mean something that we never meant in the hip-hop community. Hip-hop community meaning woke. Guess what's happened in the night? You encountering woke. But they can't have that, so they got to attach it to an LGBTQ narrative. They got to attach it to transgender. They got to attach it to something that is not, in order to get people to look at it through a different lens. And when Meryl Streep tell folk what woke really mean, the whole white audience was just looking at her like she was crazy. Therefore, it presents so-called facts and information as if they have no political connection or implications. Learning our history empowers us. Power dynamics, because I'm going to talk about one particular field in school that we ain't think got nothing to do with history, but it's riddled with it. Learning our history empowers us. The power dynamics shift when a people know their history and not the myths made up about their history. As I told you earlier, enslaved and slave are different. If we wish to change our context, Wilson really gets into it. If we wish to change our situation, quote, then we must change the power relationships. If we are to prevent ourselves from being created by another people and are to engage in the act of self-creation, then we must change the power relations. You're not going to tell me who I am. You're not going to call me Tyree. You're going to call me Dr. Anderson. I'm going to shift it. I ain't never told y'all to call me Dr. Anderson. Call me whatever you want. But once I leave here and I encounter some folk, I'm Dr. Anderson. I know what my mama named me. I'm named after my daddy. I know my name. But you don't have the right to call me that. When you go out, Brother James, do they? Hi, Johnny. Oh, no. I'm Mr. James to you. You shift the power dynamic. And the reason why you shift it is so you can stand on firm ground and let them know you can't call me what you want to call me. Because if I let it happen, you're going to label me. We must not only know, and we knew this growing up, what white children know. We had to know what they knew. We had to know more than what they knew because the chips were stacked against us. We must also learn what we know about our history. If they say George Washington chopped down the cherry tree and said, I cannot lie on the test, I don't care if you do know the truth. You put on that test what that teacher wants so you can get that grade. Then when it's over, you can say what? Dr. Carr talked about this on Saturday. I knew you was lying. But guess what? I got my grade. I'm going to give you what you want. But please know, I know the history. We must learn what is vital for our own self-development. This is why my pastor pulled together scholars and created Know Our Own History curriculum. I got it. I can implement it right here. I've been given the authorization to implement it in Birmingham. For our children to know their history. This is what Wilson says, quote, this becomes the basis for self-understanding and knowledge, a plan for the future, and means by which he or she can change his or her situation. If I know I'm not the first, we are too far into the year 2000 to keep having first for black folks. The first this, the first that. That again is them throwing their history in our face without us realizing. What is the purpose of your college degrees? We went to college, some of us went to college, What's the purpose? Our degrees are not designed for us to control our own economic situation and circumstances. We go to college to learn how to do for them. Quote, Dr. Wilson, information in the course in economics, I want you to hear this, are seen as neutral and non-political. It's just economics. Everybody participates in economics. Student, without realizing it, is more radically politicized than in any other way, without them realizing what's going on. Listen to this. According to available data, a small percentage of black individuals with economic degrees work at Fortune 500 companies, with estimates indicating that only 1% of Fortune 500 CEOs are African American. 1%. Highlighting a significant underrepresentation in executive position within these companies. According to the recent data, only a small percentage of people with economic degrees in the United States identify as black or African American, with around 5% having a bachelor's degree, 6% having a master's degree, and only 4% having a PhD. Did y'all hear those numbers? We are not in the places where we can be able to do the work that got to be done for our people. African-centered education, Dr. Wilson says, recognizes that the whole of life is a political system. As much as we don't like talking about politics in church, church is political. Church is political. Church is political. Let something not happen the way folk think. It's political. Let something happen the way they love for it to go. It's political. Church is political. Police, political. Business is political. They won't build up beyond that traffic light anything going further down 19th Street. You know where First Baptist sits, and you know what we got access to? This is an economic development zone. We could build houses, we can build a hotel, there's money available in the economic development zone for organizations that do business. We ain't got to beg for tithes and offerings. We can actually build and earn income from businesses that set up in our economic development zone. But we don't know that. Listen to this. It's through political, economic, and military action that we must change our circumstances. I ain't telling you to go out and get a gun. I don't shoot nobody. Don't do that. But I am saying that through political and economic means and understanding your right, you can actually change the circumstances. Wilson goes on and says that if those things are not applied in the context of our education, then we are being educated just to be servants. Educated servants. It goes on to say that people who are ahistorical, who have little knowledge of history, are people who are more gullible, more easily manipulated than people who can more easily adapt to the capitalist machine than people who are historically knowledgeable. They can easily adapt. Why? Because they don't know the history. Why? Because they'll take a buyout without realizing what they got. When history is not taught appropriately, we are left to just follow orders and to just judge and to just trudge to our work, our jobs, without knowing the reason why. We must recognize that merely going to work, merely studying computer science or whatever the field is, merely going into the office is not enough. We're going to have to understand the psychology of the people who run this world. Got a few more slides and we're going to wrap up. What are we to do? What should we be doing at this point? Wilson said we can only understand our oppressor psychology by understanding their history. But by understanding their history, you got to know yours. Every course we go into in school is intertwined with European history. We can't escape it. Can't escape it. Andrea, you're a realtor. Real estate transactions go all the way back to the Magna Carta. This idea that you can own land that you never had before because it was God's sanction. We just use money now, but it's no different than the many aspect of colonialism and taking over a certain territory that you say is yours. Every course we go into, consider the following field of study that is considered non-political. Mathematics. Mathematics isn't historical, right? It's non-political. Wilson notes the following lies are tied to the belief that Greece developed a higher level of mathematics. For real? According to George G.E. James in Stolen Legacy, they came to Egypt. And when they took it back to Greece, they got killed because they didn't want to hear that nonsense. So how did they develop mathematics? But you don't see no pyramids, you don't see no major buildings, you don't see none of that. Here is where they hide the truth and where it's political. Wilson knows this. We study math and would think it originated in Greece. Why? Because it's introduced that way. Class, we're going to learn the Pythagorean theory. That's history. That's European history. We're going to learn the Euclidean geometry. We're going to learn the Boolean algebra. All these European names spread throughout mathematics, but they're not telling you it's European history. They're just saying this is math. Slide it right under our noses, and we don't know it. See, history isn't simply history. Instead, it is what Wilson identified as psychohistory, because it presents the first founders, establishers of everything important that was done by Europeans without appearing to be political. Columbus found nothing. But according to them, we just had Columbus Day, right? I mean, he didn't find anything. He had an African that knew the currents and knew how to sail from one part of the world to the other, but they already knew the other side of the world existed. Egyptology. Let me say this. I study the glyphs, meta-nature. Sister Wallace studies meta-nature. According to Egyptologists, they're the ones that discovered it. Egyptologists are individuals who claim that they study Egypt, but it was another way of the Europeans to try to dominate what the glyphs were saying without realizing that they didn't know what they was talking about. The hieroglyphs on the walls of the pyramids in Egypt that they whitewashed because they took off the black color. Very important. They do it without seeming political, but it's very political. Seeing the glorification of the colonial period, the conquering of the savages, those Native Americans, and the civilizing of the Africans. It was us who did that. The purported superior of the English language. Not realizing that the English language is a garbage language because it's not pure. Some English, some Latin, but it's all mixed together. Superior of the English language. We frown on people that speak Ebonics. But you got to be bilingual if you're going to be black. You got to know Ebonics and English. But they tell us that's not proper English. Well, your proper English still isn't proper. It is the language of the most dominant colonizer, and now it is the language used for major capitalistic transactions. When I'm in Africa, they don't speak to me. When I'm in Uganda, they don't speak to me in Luganda. Speak to me in English, and the transaction is by way of $100 US bills, not by Ugandan shillings. It's the language. Wilson states, quote, the language that people learn and speak are most frequently directly related to the power relations between them. The dominant keeps the language going. They need to leave here. We speak English here. This is America. Better learn how to speak English. When you go to other parts of the world, they don't tell you need to learn how to speak Spanish. They don't tell you need to learn how to speak French. They don't tell you got to learn how to speak Ewe. They don't tell you that you got to learn how to speak Tree. They don't tell you how to speak. No, because they've learned English to talk to us because we ain't smart enough to learn what they got. History has been a large measure nothing but myth making. History as propaganda is filled in our history books. European projection of history not only serves to drive out and repress truth, but also to maintain the inflated European ego. Last 3 slides. There are great consequences to having historical amnesia. We got amnesia. When the African history is suppressed and replaced by European myths, it distorts the African personality to create amnesia to maintain repression. With the onset of amnesia, we refuse to confront the history for several reasons. Because of anxiety, because of fear, because of anger, because of shame, because of guilt. And we don't want to read some aspects of our African experience here. And we will purposely stay away from the truth. We'll avoid it. When we don't know our history, we are unable to know our true identity. We don't know who we are. And this is our true names. We don't know. Why? Because we can't trace our origins back to different tribes on the continent. Thus, we are unable to name ourselves because we do not have institutional historical memories. Quote, to take away a people's history, to degrade their history is to degrade their sense of shared identity, is to remove the basis upon which they must behave collectively and reach their goals collectively. We can't even come together and do what we got to do. How do you know that? Because the numbers I'm about to give you testify to this. Because we can't accumulate wealth because we don't know our history. You say, what does history have to do with wealth and money? Listen to this. According to the McKinsey Group, African Americans collectively spend about $910 billion annually. $910 billion. With projections showing this number could reach $1.7 trillion in 5 years, signifying a significant growth in their collective spending power. Oh, we get together and spend, but we don't get together and build. Listen to this. In 2023, 15.4% of black families were living below the poverty line in the United States, which means that almost 85% of black folks are not living below the poverty line. And we spend $910 billion a year. What in the world do these numbers mean? What do they reveal about what we think and what we've been told, that all black folk are poor? The reason why what's happening in Washington is not going to touch a lot of black folk. It ain't. We are not suffering because we don't have money. We are suffering, according to Wilson, we are suffering from the absence of an economic system due to our historical amnesia. Here's the problem. We don't trust each other. We don't trust each other. Every maladjusted characteristic in the black personify and the black personality serves an economic function. It is not the absence of money, but the absence of trust in self and in others who look like us. We could decide we're going to come together and we could take 100 people, and this is what we're saying. We can agree that everybody, and I got a system, I'm going to read it to you in a minute. We could all put our money in a pool, and every year somebody can get a large pool of that money to go start a business. And then the following year, a number out there, somebody else can do it. We don't do it because we don't trust each other. Because we are still suffering from colonialism and hatred from the plantation. Suspiciousness, according to Amos, suspiciousness and other negatives are implanted in the black collective personality so that African people cannot challenge European people. Even though we are the majority of the people on this earth and we live over the riches of this earth. Africa cannot get out of poverty because they cannot come together. Last slide. We must take control of our finances by knowing our history and what worked before we began trusting banks who are suppressing our ability to generate wealth. Get a business idea, we just run to the bank, right? No. You know what drug dealers do? They ask for the drug dealer to front them, and I bring you X amount back. And they build up their wealth, not good, but they build up their wealth by collective bargaining, and the rest of us won't do it. On the legal side, Wilson states this, quote, "We have to build a basic economy, such as a mom and pop base first." We don't have mom and pop base. He first states, quote, the banks are killing our creativity and capacity to use the money we have in our own pockets. Banks are colonial systems. When you take a look at the banking system we have today is still built on a 1940 model. How in the world can you expect anything to change in 2025 when the banking system is still a 1940 model, but it's based on a colonialism aspect? Let me read this to you, because now I want to introduce you to this process that they had in Cameroon. Very important. Very important. Listen to this. Let me see, make sure I get to the right page, because I need for you to understand that what I'm talking about isn't new. Here you go. There was a system called tonatines, T-O-N-T-I-N-E-S. Allow peasants to pool their labor rather than their money. With the introduction of money economy in the 20th century, tontines took on a financial character as a formal savings association. Every month, each member will contribute a fixed share in a pot. In a 12-member group, each member will receive the pot once a year. So whatever they agreed to, they divided it up at the end of the year. The most recent innovation is the interest-bearing tontine. Each month, members bid the amount of interest they will pay for the tontine pot. Interest payments are collected in a separate loan fund and were distributed to members when the tontine is dissolved. Tone times are usually formed for 2-year periods and were generally limited to 24 members. In contrast, banks here pay 7% annual interest on savings and lend money at 13% interest. They give you 7 and then they make 13. Inflation is about 13%. Interest earned on a saving is subject to a 10% tax, while tone times go unrecorded. The more advantageous rates offered by tone times can be traced to their lack of overhead, their ability to set rates according to supply and demand, and their high payment record. Tone times built on trust are generally made up of homogeneous groups, people from the same ethnic background. Remember, we don't trust each other. The same workplace or the same neighborhood. When people go to banks, they don't feel the same urgency to reimburse the loan. If you don't make your payment to the tone time, here you go, you are rejected by the community. If you are banned from one tone time group, you are banned from all of them. This is what happens. So what they do is they come together, they put their money, and some can decide to wait, some can get their money at the end of the year or at the end of the 2-year period, but they got enough money to invest because everybody put into the pot. We don't do that. We go to the bank and see if they'll give us some money. This method is used all over Africa, and it's used in Korea. Last piece, amnesia, because I think that's what the main problem is. Amnesia means an undiscovered self, an emptiness, a self incapable of self-understanding, incapable of understanding its own motivations, a self incapable of self-direction, self-determination, a reactionary self, a self that does not understand others or the world in which it exists. A fatalistic, externalized self. Here's what he says. To discover our history is to discover our somethingness, meaning our being, our ontological reality. To discover who we are before someone else creates us. It is essential to understand this because it is essentially the resurrection from the dead. When we know our history, nobody can tell us who we are. Any questions? Any thoughts? No thoughts at least? I said a whole lot, y'all. No thoughts? Let me pray so we can get us out of here. We'll be back tomorrow night. Eternal God, in the name of Jesus, we thank you for this time in which we have shared. Pray right now, God, that you will allow us to invest in the research of our history. God, it doesn't matter what we know, there's more to learn. Pray right now that you would keep us until we gather again on tomorrow night. Give us safe traveling, mercies home, so that we might make it there safely and find that all is well. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen. All right. Thank y'all.